This happened back in 2015 during a solo trip I took into a remote forest a few hours away from where I lived. I had heard about an old abandoned fire lookout tower hidden deep in the mountains. It used to be used by rangers to watch for wildfires, but it had been left unused for years. Technically, people weren't supposed to go inside it anymore because the structure hadn't been maintained and might not be safe. Still, I had seen a few posts online from hikers who had visited it before, and most of them said the tower was still standing and stable enough to climb. The only problem was that the most recent post I could find was about 3 years old. So I had no idea what condition it was in now. That uncertainty actually made the trip more exciting. After driving most of the morning, I finally reached the remote forest road where the hike would begin. There wasn't any official parking area, but I found a small ditch beside the road where I could pull my car over safely. I grabbed my backpack, which had enough gear for 2 days, and started heading into the forest. There wasn't really a proper trail leading to the tower. To make sure I stayed on course, I carried a handheld GPS device that showed my location using satellite signals. Even with that, most of the hike involved pushing through thick trees, bushes, and uneven terrain. The deeper I went into the forest, the more difficult the terrain became. Fallen branches, steep slopes, and dense vegetation slowed me down a lot. The hike took around 4 to 5 hours in total. By the time I finally reached the top of the hill where the lookout tower stood, I was exhausted. Through the trees, I could see the structure rising above the forest canopy. As I got closer, I was relieved to see that it was still standing. The paint on the wood had mostly faded and chipped away, but the building itself looked surprisingly solid. Before climbing up, I pushed against some of the support beams to test them. They barely moved. That gave me enough confidence to try the ladder. The ladder was made of metal and attached to the side of the tower. It felt sturdy, but every step made a loud creaking sound that echoed through the quiet forest. When I finally reached the top platform, I stopped for a moment to take in the view. It was incredible. From that height, I could see miles of forest stretching out in every direction. There were no roads, no houses, and no signs of civilization anywhere, just endless trees. After enjoying the view for a few minutes, I walked around the small platform and entered the lookout room. The room itself was tiny, probably no more than about 150 square feet. Inside, there was an old wooden desk and a small bed frame in the corner that had clearly been there for decades. The windows wrapped around the entire room, but many of them were cracked or damaged from years of weather. There wasn't much else inside. Since I planned on staying the night, I set my backpack down and rolled out my sleeping pad and sleeping bag. Using a small camping stove, I heated up a simple meal while the sun slowly began setting outside. Later, I stepped out onto the narrow walkway surrounding the tower to watch the sunset. It was easily one of the most beautiful views I had ever seen. The sky slowly turned orange and purple as the sun disappeared behind the endless forest. Unfortunately, the moment didn't last long. Soon everything became dark. The sky was covered with clouds, so there were no stars or moonlight to brighten the night. Still, I stayed outside on the platform, enjoying the silence of the forest. It must have been about an hour later when I noticed something strange down below. Between the trees, I saw a faint light moving through the forest. At first, I assumed it was someone using a flashlight, but the color of the light looked different. It had a warm orange glow and flickered slightly, almost like a small fire. The only explanation I could think of was that someone was walking through the forest carrying a torch. That immediately felt strange. This area was extremely remote, and there wasn't even a proper trail leading up to the tower. The chances of someone else wandering around this part of the forest at night seemed incredibly small. I watched the light move between the trees for several minutes. Eventually, it disappeared behind the thick forest, and I couldn't see it anymore. About half an hour passed, and the light never returned. Eventually, the cold wind started picking up, so I decided it was time to go back inside. Before going in, I leaned over the railing to look down one last time. That's when I noticed something that made my heart drop. Someone was standing directly below the tower. They were in the small grassy clearing between the tower and the trees. Even in the darkness, I could tell they were looking straight up at me. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. "Hello," I called down. The person didn't respond. They just stood there silently. After about 10 seconds, the person slowly raised their hand, almost like they were acknowledging me. Then they turned around and walked calmly back into the forest. What made it even stranger was that they didn't turn on any light while walking away. The whole encounter was extremely unsettling. But at the time, I convinced myself it was probably just another hiker who had come to check the tower and realized someone was already there. Still feeling a little uneasy, I eventually went back inside and climbed into my sleeping bag. The wind outside made the wooden structure creak constantly, which made it hard to relax. Eventually, though, I fell asleep. I don't know how long I had been sleeping when something woke me up. At first I couldn't tell what it was, then I heard it again, a slow metallic creak. It took me a second to realize what the sound was. The ladder. Someone was climbing the ladder outside. I sat up immediately, my heart starting to race. The creaking continued, step by step. Whoever it was seemed to be getting closer to the top. I couldn't see anything outside the windows because it was completely dark. I quickly grabbed my backpack and stepped outside onto the platform. As soon as I did, the ladder stopped creaking. Everything went silent. I slowly walked toward the ladder opening and looked down. No one was there. The ladder was completely empty. I stood there in confusion, trying to understand what had just happened. Then suddenly I heard fast footsteps behind me on the wooden walkway. I turned just in time to see a dark figure running past the windows on the other side of the tower. I didn't wait to see who it was. I grabbed the ladder and started climbing down as fast as I possibly could. Halfway down, I saw someone lean over the top of the platform looking down at me. I didn't stop until I reached the ground. Then I ran straight into the forest. Luckily, I had my backpack with my flashlight and GPS inside it. Without stopping, I followed the GPS through the dark forest for hours until I finally reached my car. As far as I know, I wasn't followed, but I never went back to that place again. A few years ago, I decided to spend a quiet weekend camping near a small lake deep in the woods. This place wasn't a public campground. In fact, it wasn't marked on any maps online. The only reason I knew about it was because my dad used to bring me there when I was a kid. It was one of those hidden locations that only a few locals knew about. There was a narrow footpath that led to the lake, but other than that there were no signs, no campsites, and no facilities. The reason I liked it so much was because it was always completely empty. In all the years I had been visiting that lake, I had never once seen another person there, not even any evidence that someone else had ever camped there. That weekend started out exactly how I expected. I arrived during the afternoon, set up my tent near the water, and spent the rest of the day relaxing by the lake. The forest was quiet and peaceful. That night I sat by the fire, listened to the sounds of nature, and eventually went to sleep. The next day I spent most of my time walking around the lake. It wasn't very big, so it didn't take long to circle it. Still, I walked around it several times just thinking and enjoying the scenery. Everything seemed perfectly normal, but during one of my walks around the shoreline, I noticed something that immediately made me stop. There were footprints in the dirt near the tree-lina. At first that might not sound strange, but the thing that bothered me was that I had already walked around the lake multiple times earlier and I hadn't seen them before. The prints looked fresh, and what made it even more unsettling was that they weren't shoe prints. They were barefoot prints, actual human footprints without any shoes. That didn't make much sense. The area where I found them wasn't even close to the water, so it didn't seem like someone had taken their shoes off to swim. If they had been in the lake, I would have seen them earlier. Seeing those footprints immediately made me feel uneasy. If someone else was here, why hadn't I seen them? Had they been hiding somewhere while I walked around? When I looked closer, I noticed the footprints seemed to come out from the forest, stopped near the edge of the trees as if the person had been standing there looking at the lake, and then they went back into the woods. They continued deeper into the forest where I couldn't see them anymore. I briefly considered following them, but the thought of walking alone into that dense forest after some unknown person felt like a bad idea. So instead, I returned to my campsite. For the rest of the afternoon, I kept scanning the tree-lina around the lake, expecting someone to appear, but no one ever did. As evening approached, the feeling of uneasiness slowly started growing stronger. Something about those footprints just didn't feel right. Once the sun began to set, I added extra wood to my campfire and sat beside it. The firelight helped me feel a little safer. I tried distracting myself, but it was hard to stop thinking about the possibility that someone else was somewhere in the forest nearby. Later that night, while sitting by the fire, I suddenly heard footsteps coming from the woods. They were slow and steady, and there was more than one person. It sounded like two people walking toward my campsite. My entire body tensed as I stared into the darkness where the sound was coming from. After a few seconds, two figures appeared at the edge of the firelight. One looked like a man and the other appeared to be a woman. They stopped just outside the circle of light from my campfire. Because of the darkness, I couldn't see their faces clearly. I couldn't even tell how old they were. "Can I help you?" I asked. The moment I spoke, the woman suddenly turned and sprinted back into the forest without saying a word. She disappeared into the darkness almost instantly. The man, however, stayed where he was. He didn't chase after her. He didn't even react. He just stood there silently. That's when I looked down at his feet. He wasn't wearing shoes. Immediately, I realized these must have been the same footprints I saw earlier near the lake. I asked him again if he needed something. He didn't respond. After a few seconds, he slowly turned around and walked calmly back into the woods, disappearing just like the woman did. The moment they were gone, I felt a wave of panic hit me. The entire encounter felt incredibly strange and unsettling. I didn't want to stay there any longer. Without wasting time, I immediately started packing my gear. Luckily, my camping setup was simple, so within a few minutes everything was packed back into my bag. Before leaving, I spread out the burning logs from the fire so it would burn out safely after I left. Then I started the long walk back through the forest. The hike back to my truck would take almost 2 hours. For the first several minutes, I kept looking behind me, worried that someone might be following me. Eventually, the forest grew quiet again and I started to feel a little more relaxed, but about 40 minutes into the walk, something terrifying happened. I heard running footsteps somewhere in the forest nearby. The sound was maybe about 800 feet away from me, but I couldn't see anything. I kept walking, trying to stay calm. A few minutes later, I heard running footsteps again. This time they were on the other side of me. That's when I realized something. The footsteps sounded strangely quiet, almost like whoever was running was barefoot, which meant it could have been the same two people from the campsite. For the next part of the walk, I kept hearing short bursts of running in the forest around me. Sometimes the sound would appear ahead of me, other times behind me. It felt like someone was following me through the woods while staying hidden. That walk through the forest was easily one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Eventually, though, I made it back to my truck. I got inside, started the engine, and left immediately. To this day, I still have no idea who those two people were or why they were out there in the forest. Sometimes I even wonder if they were really people at all. Whatever they were, I never returned to that lake again. A couple of years ago, I was traveling along the West Coast living out of a small camper van. At the time, I was 24 and had been moving from place to place for several months. Instead of staying in crowded cities, I preferred driving through small towns and remote areas where I could park somewhere quiet for the night. Most of the time, I chose isolated places deep in nature. Strangely enough, I always felt safer being alone in the forest than parking overnight in busy city parking lots. That week I was traveling through Washington state, slowly making my way between two large cities. I wasn't in any rush, so I spent most of my time taking back roads and stopping at random forest spots to rest for a day or two. Late one afternoon, I found a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the trees. Curious, I turned onto it and began driving deeper into the forest. There were a few small pull-off areas along the road where people could park, but they all looked unused. It seemed like no one had been down that road in a long time. I kept driving, hoping to find a more private spot. Eventually, the road ended in a wide clearing surrounded by tall trees. In the middle of the clearing was an old stone fire pit. It wasn't a scenic view or anything special, but it was quiet and completely hidden by the forest. It seemed like the perfect place to stay for the night. I parked the van, leveled it out, and got comfortable inside. Since it was spring in Washington, it rained almost every day. That evening was no different. Light rain had already started falling through the trees. I opened the sliding door of the van for some fresh air while I cooked dinner on a small propane stove. By the time I finished eating, the sun had already disappeared behind the trees. The rain slowly grew heavier. I closed the door and cracked open one of the small windows near the back of the van. Then I climbed onto the bed and started watching a show on my laptop. About halfway through the episode, something caught my attention. A light suddenly reflected across my laptop screen. At first, I thought it was lightning, but the reflection was too steady. Before I could even turn around, the light disappeared. Not faded away, it shut off instantly, like someone had switched it off. I turned around and looked out the small window behind me. Outside, everything was completely dark. Rain was pouring down, and I couldn't see more than a few feet into the forest. The strange part was that the light didn't seem like it came from the road I had driven in on. Behind the van, there were only thick trees. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe another camper had pulled into the area with their headlights on and then turned their vehicle off. Still, something about it didn't quite make sense. After a while, I shrugged it off and went back to watching my show. Every now and then I thought I heard something outside, but the rain hitting the metal roof of the van made so much noise that it was hard to tell if I was imagining things. Whenever I looked out the windows, I never saw anything. Eventually, around 10 or 11 p.m., I decided to go to sleep. I shut down my laptop, closed the small window, and pulled down the covers over the windows so no one could see inside. The van became almost completely dark. I climbed under the blankets and tried to sleep. Normally, I fall asleep quickly when camping, but that night I just couldn't relax. The rain kept getting heavier, and soon thunder began rumbling through the forest. The storm made it impossible to sleep. After lying there for what felt like hours, I suddenly heard something outside. It sounded like someone running through the forest nearby. I heard a branch snap loudly on the ground, then everything went silent again. I slowly looked toward the window, but it was so dark outside that I couldn't see anything at all. The longer I stared into the darkness, the more uncomfortable I started to feel. It felt like someone might be standing out there watching the van. I quickly pulled the window cover back down. A minute later, something else happened. I heard a voice outside. It was a man's voice, speaking quietly, almost like he was whispering to someone else. My heart started pounding. I stayed completely silent, too afraid to move. For several minutes, I heard nothing except the rain and thunder. Then suddenly something pressed against the sliding door of the van. The plastic panel bent slightly, like someone was leaning against it. A second later, there was a knock. I froze. A few seconds passed. Then the knocking came again. I was certain by now that whoever was outside knew someone was inside the van, but I was too scared to respond. Maybe they weren't sure if I was alone or not. Maybe staying quiet was the safest option. For the next few minutes, the knocking continued every few seconds. Finally, the person spoke again. "Sheriff's Department, open the door." The moment I heard that, I knew something wasn't right. If it really were a police officer, why didn't they say that immediately when they first knocked? Instead, they had been silently knocking for several minutes. The voice outside kept repeating different things, all claiming they were law enforcement and ordering me to open the door. It sounded desperate, like they were trying to convince me to unlock it. Slowly, I lifted the corner of the window cover and peeked outside. In the darkness, I could see a figure moving near the door, but from what I could tell, he wasn't wearing any type of police uniform. That's when I realized how dangerous the situation could become. For about 30 seconds, I sat there trying to decide what to do. The knocking was getting louder and more impatient. Finally, I decided the best chance I had was to escape. I quietly climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition. The moment the engine started, I heard two sets of footsteps running toward the van, so there wasn't just one person outside. I immediately put the van into gear and started driving. As I pulled away, I saw a dark figure appear beside the driver's window. Thankfully, the van didn't get stuck in the mud. Within seconds, I was back on the dirt road driving away from the clearing. As I drove down the road, I didn't see any other vehicles anywhere, which made the entire situation even more disturbing. Later, I reported the incident to the local county office. They confirmed that no sheriff's deputies had been in that area that night. Whatever those people were planning, I'm glad I didn't open that door.